good morning to you, Will. It's fantastic to have you here.
Hi, Jess. How are you?
Very well, very well. So I'm going to ask Will a few questions. Will, the CEO of EQ Connect, and EQ Connect is a company that's doing something really quite revolutionary with data to initiate really powerful change in the world of gambling. So Will, I mean, you've done product innovation at Barclays and you've also been head of futures at Kindred Group for some time. Kindred is the owner of several really well-known gambling brands. So thanks for joining us today to give us your expertise on how EQ Connect is kind of changing a really sort of fast-moving industry. Before we get into that, I mean, the subject for this episode is the journey to the truth through data, and I think a lot of us are trying to put data at the center of innovation. And in this instance, actually, we're going to talk about innovating in an industry, but also social change as well. Now, as we talk about that, usually what happens, there's lots of thoughts that occur to people, and there's a Q&A box on your screens. It's usually at the bottom of your screen. It depends what device you're on. There's a special Q&A box, which works much better than the chat function. So if you just put any questions in there, then we'll aim to get through as many as possible once I've finished exploring a few issues with Will in the next 15 minutes. So do that and pop them in any time, and we'll try and answer as many as we can. So enough from me, over to Will. So Will, let's talk a little bit about EQ Connect first of all. It's a company that analyzes data to identify at-risk or risky gambling behavior. It would be great if we could start off and you could tell us a bit about what's behind this initiative.
Yeah, hi Jess. So EQ Connect is seeking to solve a significant challenge that prevents the online gambling industry from effectively identifying and appropriately interacting with gamblers who may be or have already developed a problem or addiction to gambling. And the challenge that we're seeking to solve is born out of the fact that one online gambling company, or an operator, as I know, has no knowledge of a player's interaction or level of play with any other gambling company. So the operator only has a partial view of a player's total play. And this has three hugely damaging implications from a vulnerable player's perspective. So firstly, you have the situation where a player may open a new account with operator X, let's say, and then start playing. So operator X just sees a new customer, so starts to encourage them to play, usually with bonuses or other incentives. But operator X has no sight of the fact that the player may have spent the last several hours or days even gambling with operator Y or Z or many others, and that player has been exhibiting all the classic signs of problematic gambling behavior with those operators. So operator X, by bonusing and incentivizing, is unknowingly worsening the player's problem, adding to the harm that player is and will suffer from. The second damaging implication is that if an operator does start to suspect a player has a developing gambling problem and tries to interact with the player to help them, then that player can simply go next door digitally and create an account with a new operator. So the well-intentioned operator that's trying to help simply loses that player, loses all ability to contact that player to a new operator who does not have sight of a developing problem and will not even try to interact with the player to help them. More on the contrary, they'll bonus and incentivize them to try and get them to play more. So the vulnerable player continues to play, the harm they suffer continues and worsens over time. And then thirdly, if play is spread over several operators, as it regularly is, then each operator only sees a much diluted view of total play. And they similarly see a much diluted view of any problem. So as a result, no single operator might see enough problematic play to warrant any form of intervention or interaction. So they don't. So the player continues, the problem continues, and the problem worsens. So putting those three together, almost however well-intentioned or capable an individual operator is when it comes to identifying problem gamblers, they simply cannot be effective in protecting the player because they only have a very partial view of the player's activity, and because the player can always simply go next door to a new operator. So the EQ proposition was designed to solve this by creating a cross-operator view of a player's real-time gambling behavior, aggregating data at a player level from all operators, and then provide this as sort of real-time risk information about players who are showing signs of problematic play back to whichever operator they're playing with, which will allow the operator to take the right actions at the right time to protect vulnerable players and reduce the harm suffered.
Thanks, Will, very much for that. So we've kind of dived into what EQ Connect does, and I think it would be great for you now, because I know you've worked in the gambling industry for some time, to give a bit of background to, I guess, what is happening in the gambling industry. Why is this initiative so important now? Any context would be great. Yeah,
certainly. No, very aware that to many gambling is something that you maybe see on the high street, but don't have much close involvement with. So the UK gambling industry is worth, I think, £14.5 billion a year, of which about 5 billion is online gambling. So it's sizable as an industry. Globally, it's in the hundreds of billions and increasing all the time. In the UK, it employs about 100,000 people. And interestingly, participation rates surprise many. This is data taken from the Gambling Commission's sort of annual survey, and the Commission is the regulator. 47% of the UK adult population have undertaken some form of gambling in the last 4 weeks. And that reduces to 32% when you're excluding the National Lottery. But it's still a sizable number, and one that surprises many. Of those, that sort of gambling population, 56% of people have more than one online account. But that ramps up to 5 online accounts for 18 and 34-year-olds. So different sort of segments of the population, sort of gambling in different ways. But anecdotally, and there's less data to prove this, problem gamblers can have hundreds of accounts and will switch between them based on offers or evading the controls. The numbers of problem gamblers are often debated, and there isn't a scientific or medical definition of problem gambling particularly, so it's difficult to be precise. But around about 2 million adults are considered to be at some form of risk of problem gambling or developing a problem, with 250,000 classified as problem gamblers today. So those are large numbers of people that are at risk of problem gambling. And problem gambling manifests itself in different ways with different people. There was a study done a couple of years ago that tried to quantify the direct cost to UK society, to the government, of problem gambling. And again, very difficult to do, but they found it somewhere in a range of 260 million to 1 billion. And that's direct economic impact per year on society. The way it manifests itself are sort of bankruptcy, debt, homelessness, crimes committed, divorce, separation, this relationship breakdown, stress, depression, and I guess most disturbingly, suicide. It's estimated that 5% of problem gamblers have attempted suicide and 19% have contemplated suicide. These are big numbers of people, significant numbers, certainly. Also, probably worth mentioning the sort of regulatory or political context that the gambling industry is operating within. The pressure from the media and the regulators and the politicians has been ramping up significantly over the last few years. And there are a number of media outlets that appear anyway to have a decidedly anti-gambling industry editorial stance, and they regularly run stories about gambling industry failures. The regulator has been far more proactive in the last few years in requiring operators to do more to protect players, and been issuing much larger fines, often running into the millions for failures. And politically too, there are strong groups of parliamentarians who are consistently lobbying for ever more punitive measures to be imposed upon the gambling industry. There's about to be a review of the legislation that governs gambling, and I think it's widely expected that this will be fairly punitive on the industry, and perhaps rightly so.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that. Now, I can see that a few people kind of tend to just to join us as we've started. So for those that are joining, first of all, welcome. And also, if you see, if you think of any questions at all, whilst Will and I are talking, I'm with Will Mace, CEO of EQ Connect, and we're just going to really deep dive in a minute into some of how EQ Connect works. Then please do put your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom, because this is an incredibly interesting business and an incredibly interesting sector, Will. And I think what you've outlined is actually it's yes, clearly it's specific to the gambling industry, but there's some really interesting principles, particularly about how digital business and the digital world and is, has, there are social implications that I think now are certainly being picked up in regulatory and political circles. And so I think we can explore that in a bit more detail later. Before we do that, let's sort of think a little bit more about the data aspect, because data, as we all know, data is an asset, and everybody is under pressure to use data more effectively, and to manage large data volumes, and essentially have data management strategies that are incredibly robust, and that's a real challenge. EQ Connect really is a data business. So what are some of the more technical challenges in aggregating player data, and I think actually also getting collaboration between players in what I assume must be a very, very competitive sector?
Yes, there are challenges everywhere, certainly. We are a data business, as you say, and there are a number of technical challenges. One of the most interesting ones is in identity resolution. So is Bob Smith that has registered an account with William Hill the same Bob Smith that's registered with Ladbrokes? And he may have registered as Robert Smith with Bet365, or Bobby Smith with Paddy Power. We need to be able to bring those customer records together and ascertain whether it's the same person or whether it's several people. There are people who use many different email addresses, phone numbers, addresses, etc. So that identity resolution piece is a key challenge. But also identifying the harmful patterns of behavior, again, amongst the sort of vast volumes of data. And the data is in many different formats and structures. So it's a huge challenge. We're very lucky to have a very capable data scientist and technical team. And so they're managing that component of it for us, but it's very significant. The amount of data we're talking about is fairly extraordinary. There's also the real-time component. In extreme cases, significant harm can be suffered by the gambler in very short periods of time. So we need to be able to flag the risk and the changing risk profile to an operator in real time, so that they can take that immediate appropriate action with a player. So there's not only identifying the patterns of harmful play amongst vast amounts of data, but also doing it in real time and returning something meaningful to the operators to allow them to take action. But as you identified, I think the real challenge that we're facing is perhaps not technical, but it's driving this level of collaboration in what is a highly competitive industry. There's certainly no history of data sharing in the gambling industry, but lots of history of protecting and defending valuable players from your competitors. So this is quite a departure, and there's definitely a degree of reluctance and hesitance, certainly from the more commercially minded people at the organizations we're needing to work with.
Yeah, that's unsurprising. And I think some of the things that you said there are really fascinating. And again, I think other businesses are grappling with large data volumes, the real-time element, and also, I suppose, there's a desire to get to know customers at a deeper level and to understand their behavior across lots of industries. So I think that this is where, there's certainly lots of principles that can be applied. Again, just to sort of go back to data, because it is so critical. And I wonder if you can just expand a little bit on kind of some of the data protection issues around your work.
Yeah, sure. And again, this is certainly one of the key areas that we've had to navigate, or in the process of navigating. So GDPR, as I guess everyone will know, is there to protect an individual's personal data from being misused, and has a strong focus on the rights of the individual. And yeah, this is a good thing. And I'm sure everyone's pretty happy for them to have well-protected rights over their own data. But our proposition, however, relies upon the sharing of data to identify and then protect vulnerable gamblers. We need a valid basis under GDPR for operators to share their players' data with us, for us to then process and store it. And we've looked at, I think there are 6 different potential legal bases under GDPR. And we started off by looking at the 3 that are most applicable. Consent is the one that I guess most people are most familiar with, and constantly being asked for permission for this, that. In our case, we felt it would not be the appropriate basis, because if you do not consider yourself to be a vulnerable gambler, as 98% of the population are not, then you probably would withhold your consent, and rightly so. You don't need the protection that this is offering. But if you are vulnerable, or if you are in the grips of an addiction, then you're also going to withhold your consent because you don't want to have your play restricted. So consent is not a legal basis that I think would allow this to work. We then looked at legal obligation, which is one of the other potential bases. Operators are legally required to interact with their players in a way to minimize the potential for harm. But that legislation, that sort of legal regulation, was written in 2005, which is a world away. The world of gambling is entirely different. The world of digital is entirely different. So there's a general view that the legislation requiring operators to protect people is not strong enough to permit this form of data sharing under GDPR. That view has not been tested legally, but it seems to be the prevailing opinion. And then the third potential basis is legitimate interest, and this is the one that I think is the most appropriate. And surely there's a legitimate interest in seeking to protect vulnerable players, but it's not without challenge. A player that considers themselves not at risk could readily claim there is no legitimate interest in having their data shared because they don't need protecting, and that's an argument that can certainly be made. But this is sort of conceptually, I think, quite interesting, maybe because I'm a bit of a data geek. Whose legitimate interest? And the GDPR was written with, in this case, the player's interest in mind, because it's about protecting individual rights. But the regulator and the politicians are increasingly telling gambling companies that they are responsible for ensuring that players are protected. And this is a change to a few years ago, when it was up to a player really to protect themselves, which is clearly nonsensical. If a player's in the grip of an addiction, you're not capable of protecting yourself really. So if you've got the regulator saying it's up to the operators to protect their vulnerable players, but legitimate interest is based on an individual, you've got a clash here. So the question we're working with the ICO through is, can we stretch legitimate interest to put it onto the operators, to their legitimate interest, because they have a regulatory responsibility to protect their players? It's unsure. The ICO are engaging with us. This is an area of, I guess, genuine uncertainty about what compliance looks like. But I think it's clear that without data sharing, player protection is largely window dressing. So it's vital to protect players. But the law was not written from that perspective, and so it's trying to navigate a way through it with the ICO.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm sure, Will, that as this work progresses and as others, I mean, regulation and legislation around data protection will have to evolve all the time, simply because it's a pretty fast moving terrain. It'd be interesting to pick up, I guess, later on or in a few months' time, as to see how that's going. I'm going to just change tack a little bit, actually, because I guess there's various things to explore. This is a really innovative project. It's quite unusual. It's technically challenging, and it's strategically challenging. So if we sort of think a little bit about innovation at the moment, because there's a lot of different elements to this. You've worked on driving innovation in gambling and also in financial services. I mean, how do you nurture innovation? Particularly something like this, which is really complex. What does your experience tell you?
There's definitely no easy answer to that, and certainly no single answer to that. I've worked in two very different companies trying to drive innovation in different forms. But every company will be in a different situation, different points on a sort of innovation maturity curve. So what's good or effective or the right thing in one company, it might be entirely inappropriate for another. Some innovation teams or an R&D capability, hackathons, idea management, internal incubators, all of these things can have a place in some companies, but might be entirely wrong for others. There's definitely a risk of innovation theatre, and this was a challenge at Barclays, certainly that lots of senior people knew they had to do something with innovation, but didn't really know what, and so they threw lots of money at sort of it's matured since the time I was there, certainly. But it was to create the impression of great innovation, but the vast majority of the organization continued working in the same way they had always worked. There are some really interesting problems, I guess, companies need to solve. And again, different answers for different companies, but is innovation part of a core or is it separate to the core? Are you focusing on strategic innovation or more incremental innovation? And there isn't a right answer. Two things, though, probably I would say do apply everywhere, will apply everywhere. Culture and leadership. I don't really like the phrase innovation culture, but there has to be a mindset at various levels in an organization that's open to investigating, to learning, to experimenting, and taking risks. And that can be fostered, certainly, but equally it can be squashed. And then leadership. I think perhaps the most important factor in fostering innovation. Leaders set the tone of any company. They create the culture, they create expectations, ways of working, hiring policies, right through to performance reviews and incentive schemes. All of these can either create or destroy the circumstances for innovation to flourish. So sorry, no easy answer to that, which is why there are hundreds of innovation consultants out there and thousands of books about it. But yeah, leadership and culture, I guess, would feature in most answers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose we're finding ourselves in a period of great uncertainty where there could be some incredible innovation, and necessity is the mother of invention. So it'll be interesting to sort of see what happens over the next few months. But I guess this is a time where organisations have kind of got to be innovative. If they want to survive and maybe do things quite differently. So I think it's always worth kind of looking at that. Before we kind of open up to questions, and we've had a couple come through, I would encourage people to use the Q&A box and sort of have a think. If there's anything that you want to ask, to sort of pop that in there. We're talking about data and how to kind of use that to drive innovation, some of the challenges around collaborating with data, sharing data between competitive organizations. So do add any questions, and I'll try and fire as many as I can at will in a second. But one thing I guess I want to sort of to look at is, what EQ Connect does is quite unique. I think when we talked before, what it reminded me of was how the insurance industry has had to come together to fight insurance fraud, and that the level of collaboration there has been really significant, and that developed over a long time, I guess. That said, it's similar, but it's not the same. I mean, this is identifying behaviour that individuals themselves may well not agree is even an issue. So it's really sort of quite unique. That said, the model that you have developed, could that apply to other sectors at all? Do you sort of see any other applications of it in anything that you're doing?
Yeah, it is interesting. As you said, data sharing is becoming increasingly the norm, but it's usually associated with a direct benefit to the data subject. So in return for data, you receive something relatively tangible. This could be sharing health data for lower insurance premiums or for more effective diagnosis, sharing purchase history or viewing history for personalized recommendations and ads, etc. What we're doing is subtly different, I think, and perhaps because the gambling industry is fairly unique. It's entertainment for most, but has the potential to cause significant harm for a small minority. So it's hard to find many directly comparable sectors. But at the core of our proposition, it's, we're about sharing data to protect, to reduce harm. And there'll be similar, I guess, there'll be similar other similar sectors that our approach or our approach to behaviors, I guess, could be applied to. But I think gambling is pretty unique, and it'd be interesting if anyone listening has got thoughts on other industries that it could be applied to. But I think it is pretty unique. What's interesting, I was listening on the radio this morning about the coronavirus tracking and tracing app that's being discussed by the ethics committee this evening, I think. Obviously, there are some fairly exceptional circumstances to the sort of development and pushing of that app. And the benefits, to my mind, certainly outweigh the privacy implications of it. But others, I'm sure, will disagree. But I didn't necessarily think that this will be form a tipping point where individual rights and individual privacy is demoted in favor of society benefit. But it's definitely interesting. There are parallels with what we're doing, certainly, at a conceptual level, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's incredibly topical, and I think that there's a really interesting debate around that, and actually something that we hope to bring along to the Breakfast Club in a few weeks' time, to kind of look at some of the data sharing and the privacy implications. There's some very strong opinions on that around coronavirus, because it's on such a massive scale. Thank you so much for that, Will. What I'm going to do now, we've had a couple of questions come through, and so I'm going to turn to those to give the opportunity for some of the people that are listening and watching to kind of engage with you. And as I said, if any thoughts occur to anybody at all, then please do pop them in the Q&A box, and we'll try and get through as many things as we can. And then there's a couple of other questions that have come through somewhere else, so we can add those in as well. So firstly, I want to Will S has this is a really interesting question actually about your sort of the solution that the EQ Connect has, and this is about whether can it apply to the high street betting shops, either to the over-the-counter, the fixed odds betting terminals, but this may mean that the way bets are placed in shops has to change. So what are some of the implications around that, if you will?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's one that we are in discussion with, and we actually discussed it with William Hill just the other day. So the way betting shops work, for those that don't know, you can walk in off the street entirely anonymously with a sort of handful of tenors and pass them over the counter and receive a betting slip. You don't have to give your name, any form of identification, and then your betting slip, if you win, you go back into the shop and redeem it for more money. For your winnings. So there's no way of tracking that player at all at the moment. There's no account-based play on the high street. Casinos, you do need to be a member of a casino in order to play there. So when you go into the casino, you swipe your membership card, and so there is a form of tracking there. So in order for our solution to be effective in the betting shop scenario, we would have to move the entire way of placing bets from the anonymous handing a tenner over the counter to account-based play. So you'd have to be registered with the bookie in order to place a bet. Whether that's going to happen in the forthcoming gambling review or not, I don't know. It does get talked about from time to time. There are definitely benefits, because it would allow the industry to monitor and protect vulnerable customers. But then on the other hand, you've got the privacy lobby, which is very strong in the UK, obviously, saying, why should, if I want to go and put a tenner on Chelsea to win next Saturday, why should I have to give this information and that information about it? So it's a debate that has not been resolved. But as things currently stand, without account-based play in betting shops, it would be very hard for a solution such as ours to to properly protect.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll go. There's a couple of questions that sort of that look at some of the competitive elements, and particularly some of the players. So we'll come to those in just one second. But before that, from Chris, now we talked a bit about data protection. I mean, and he's asked with regard to data sharing across organisations. So now, did you approach the ICO before implementing this, or what was the engagement there? Maybe if you could just sort of take us over that briefly, that'd be great.
So we haven't yet implemented it. We're still in a sort of pilot phase, working with 2 or 3 of the large operators to collaboratively design and build before implementing anything. And we have approached the ICO to advise on our pilot design. We're aware there are many different views and opinions as to the correct legal basis and how to develop this, and so it just made sense to approach the ICO and get them to engage early. We were sort of helped by the fact the Gambling Commission are also very interested, not in us as a company necessarily, but as in solving this problem. And so the Gambling Commission had discussed with the ICO what support they could give the industry in solving this. So when we approached them, I guess the foundation had already been laid there. But yeah, I definitely see the ICO as a vital sort of component in solving this. It's not easy. There's no right answer, and every lawyer you consult will have very, very different views. So having the ICO as a reasonably sort of close partner advisor is really useful.
Thank you. And actually, to sort of shift it into sort of the players and I guess the behaviours that that you can track. But at the moment, we've had a question come through, which quite rightly asks about the impact of the current situation of lockdown on gambling addiction and kind of gambling in general. I mean, have you seen any changes? I guess what's your view?
So I guess as lockdown was being announced, there was a huge fear that the anti-gambling lobby were very quick to flag the sort of perceived danger that people in stressful, anxious situations, worried about money, worried about the future, or simply with more time on their hands, might in turn to sort of increase gambling. And those that were already vulnerable would suffer considerably more as a result, and more people would become in that sort of vulnerable at-risk bracket because of the situation. And the industry were actually, to their credit, were quite quick to announce a number of measures to try and mitigate that heightened risk, monitoring for different play levels, different play patterns, voluntary advertising bans, etc. Actually, some data was published by the Gambling Commission just, I think it was yesterday or the day before, that shows that perhaps some of the fears were slightly overplayed. And the headline was that actually more people have stopped gambling or are gambling less than have started or increased. So at a sort of national level, the picture is good, I guess. This may be no surprise. Sport has been cancelled pretty much in its entirety, and sports betting made up a huge proportion of the gambling industry. So gambling companies have seen their revenue from sports betting drop to zero overnight. And, sympathy required for the gambling companies, but there's a lot less betting going on in the entirety. Some products have seen an uplift. Poker particularly has seen an uplift. It's quite a social game. It's something you can play over a few hours and, with friends or just online. But poker's not really a product that's associated with gambling related harm. It's the nature of it. It's not a sort of key product. There will be players, there are players, I have no doubt, that have played more, played for longer, suffered harm as a result of impacts of the lockdown. But fortunately, the data is showing on a mass scale that it's not happening in the way that it was perhaps feared to be possible.
Yeah, absolutely. To go back to gambling companies, a couple of questions on that. Again, we touched on it a bit, but have some of the big players in the gambling industry been more open to this idea than others, first of all? And then secondly, it's just, what are any barriers you're facing in, I guess, bringing them around to that way of thinking and engaging with you, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so there are 5 or 6 big players in the UK, and they cover something like 75 to 80% of the market. And by and large, they've been open to discussion. I guess one of the challenges for any startup is knocking on the door and just getting the first meeting, getting the chance to pitch. And And for us, we found that relatively easy, partly because my co-founders and I had been in the industry for some time, and we know the industry well, and we know a number of the people we needed to see. And we found an open door almost everywhere, not quite everywhere, but pretty much everywhere. Companies were keen to engage and to see what the value could be. A couple of companies have raised flags around data privacy and said, we're really unsure about how this works from a data privacy perspective. We need help from the ICO or the Gambling Commission before we want to go too much further, because they perceive a legal risk. And that's because their lawyers have advised them that it's very unclear. Other companies have had different advice, or have said, well, yes, we see there's a legal risk, but let's work with the ICO and the Gambling Commission to find a way through this. So we've had from an initial positive response from almost all the companies, and then it's gone. The different companies have definitely shown different appetite for working collaboratively to find a way to a solution. But I think everybody agrees there is a need for a solution. The problem is very real. The challenge is does the GDPR regulation or the data privacy regulation allow us to solve this, or because it's been written from an individual protection perspective, does it create insurmountable obstacles? But I do want to say that the gambling companies, the operators, are working under this threat, let's say, of punitive legislative review. And so whilst lots of companies are engaging with us and taking all sorts of actions to increase their player protection, they're doing it knowing that if they're not seen to be sufficiently proactive in player protection, the operating environment could change significantly and become far, far less attractive for them. So there's a degree of self-interest in being seen to do as much as possible. But that's good, because anything that helps protect players, let's not worry too much about the motives if players are being better protected.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, just thinking about companies with powerful lobbies, so somebody's actually mentioned that another industry with similar sort of considerations and using data to protect the customer, and one that may well become more regulated in the future, is actually the pornography industry as well. So whether there is whether there are principles that could apply here, I don't know.
Yes, possibly. It's not an industry I can discuss in detail. I would be interested to know whether pornography addiction is a thing and what levels of harm could be suffered from a pornography addiction. And yeah,
no, absolutely, but genuinely, I mean, this is where there are these sort of major societal issues where data is revealing more all the time. They may be murky subjects, and we might not all want to get into them for sure. But I do think that the opportunities around that could be quite interesting. One very last question, and really quickly, but this is a comment from Paul. But just any thoughts from you? Any further thoughts about this is a debate about really the individual centric data policies and the extent to which COVID-19 may change things. I mean, at the moment, the individual is king. Do you think that is going to change as COVID unravels, I guess, with respect to data privacy?
I don't actually, and I think the UK, it's the rights of the individual and privacy are so ingrained in British society that I don't think they're going to change overnight. And I think the COVID tracing and tracking app, there's a huge, clear, obvious need for people to swallow their personal privacy to solve this problem. Once it's solved, if it's solved, then there's nothing to stop everyone deleting that app and not sharing their location again. And I'm sure that's what we will all do when there isn't a need to do it. So I don't know if this is a tipping point. I don't think so. I think it would take years and years and years and change of culture to have the individual rights subservient to group or state rights.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. We've covered so much ground. I'm really delighted to hear about all the work at EQ Connect. Good luck with everything. And I will hand back to Emma now. Thank you so much, Will.
Thanks, Jess. It's been fun.
Thank you both very much indeed. I think, as Jess says, there are some really important facts there that we need to think about, and indeed that we can relate to many other industries. So thank you both very much. And we'll very much look forward to seeing both of you, obviously, at Chief Disruptor Live. The focus is very much on pivot to a new future, which is many of the themes that our members are really needing right now. So that's going to run on Tuesday, the 2nd of June. Please do join us if you haven't already. You can see how to sign up to that, and indeed some of the masterclasses that will be running for you, some of the keynotes, and indeed some of the breakout sessions that we're running. All of that's available on the website, and the link to that you can hopefully see now as well. We'd love you to bring your colleagues, your peers, and so on. Really, the ultimate aim is to connect the change makers and disruptors, and to equip everyone with actual insights and with strategies.